Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Tuesday, July 18th. The quality of our democracy has been an ongoing subject of discussion in recent years, and as our nation has seemed to have drifted into more polarized opposing camps, where positions on ideological issues have seemed to harden. So is the answer, or at least part of the answer, in a more vigorous form of face-to-face, boots-on-the-ground democratic practice. That's one of the points our guest today, Susan Clark, and the co-author of a much-admired book on the subject of local grassroots democracy, is making as being one of the keys to strengthening our representative republic. The book is entitled Slow Democracy. It was written in 2012, but still very relevant today, maybe more so. She wrote it with co-author Woden Teachout, and it's full of insights about the importance of small local democratic engagement. And it's our pleasure to welcome Susan Clark, who's a writer and an educator, and also a co-author with Frank Bryan of All Those in Favor, Rediscovering the Secrets of Town Meeting and Community. Welcome her here to our show today. She is also a writer and educator, and in her spare time is also the town moderator of Middlesex, Vermont. Susan Clark, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
It was my pleasure, and I've been looking forward to this discussion for quite a while. I think it's going to be very interesting and fascinating. But first, I wanted to ask you, what prompted you and Woden Teachout to co-author this book? What gave you the idea for it?
So, how did we come up with the idea of slow democracy? It's really built on the slow food, and if you think about the whole idea of food, our food systems, eating as an agricultural act, as Wendell Berry said, the idea that when you understand where your food comes from, and you can see the processes, the farmers, you are more likely to make wise decisions about the food that you eat and have much more responsibility in creating the support that those things are needed. And you'll enjoy it more. That idea was so resonant to me. I was actually in the garden when it popped into my head. I think I was listening to the Omnivore's Dilemma book in my headphones, and it was like, this is the work that we do in the democratic facilitation and so many of the communities that I work with. It's a very similar metaphor. It's like, oh, slow food is slow democracy. That's what we're talking about. And I told my husband about it. He was like, "Oh, great idea! Slow democracy. Maybe you can get the website." And then he said, "Maybe while you're at it, you can get painfuldentistry.com as well." Because he was just like, "You got to be kidding me! Why want your democracy to be more slow?" But hopefully, your listeners who sympathize with the idea of that local connection, that community connection, the importance of social capital and reciprocity and trust, can understand that we're not talking about democracy that's just longer and slower. And we define it pretty rigorously. We're talking about, more democratic decisions being brought to the local level, and that the processes should have three key elements, and they are three pieces of jargon for you here. The first one is inclusion, and not simply that we feel represented, but that we actually can be invited to participate in decisions. Deliberative is the second key, and that means not just talking. Again, we define it rigorously, and there's an entire field now on democratic deliberation. It's a process where you actually gather, a full range of information, and where you have a rich deliberative process to look at the pros and cons of both sides, and where you can really weigh options and create solutions together. So I think of a good deliberative process as being not A versus B, but let's co-create C, And then the third one is power, not just divided, but we as community members, as citizens, and I use that word advisedly, I'm a person who is a part of their community. I'm not talking about anything to do with ICE or anything like that, but where we really have can see the connection between my participation and what happens, and that is the oxygen of functioning democracy.
So do you think a democracy in that form, the slow democracy, what condition is it in at the moment? Do you feel like we're, despite all the tumult we see occasionally on the national level, or even on the state level, it's basically working well and strong, or at the local level, like at town meetings and other forms of community interaction, we've got something to worry about?
Well, plenty to worry about for sure. I do think that the polls continue to show that we have less trust in our national democracy, a little bit more trust in our state democracies, and by far the most trust in our local democracy. So I think that that's there's nothing new there, although I do think it's probably getting a little worse in terms of the digital. Along with the trend toward polarization that you mentioned, we are seeing also just a serious uptick in people's concern about democracy. When we wrote this book in 2012, I sometimes, had a little trouble convincing people that democracy was anything we had to worry about. They were like, that's a thing that we have. It's not a thing that we do. It's a structure, and it'll be fine. And that's certainly not what I'm finding now. People are very concerned about democracy. And so that at least is a hopeful sign that people want to talk about this more. And slow, the idea of slow, while it can be, at first blush, it's like, why would we want things to be slower? It resonates for people when, you start looking at the brain science, and we have more and more brain science now. There was a study, I think it was in 2006, but it's been replicated many times since, where researchers wired up our brains to find out what happens when we get new information. And in particular, when we get new information that might not jive with our worldview. So they had a group of self-described Republicans and Democrats, subjected to unflattering information about their own candidates. And according to their MRIs, when they got that information in, their brains actually underprocessed the information. So the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for content reasoning, it hardly even fired. And so what we realize now is that this is a physiological reaction that happens to all of us, liberals and conservatives alike, and we can attribute it to our tribal ancestors. Thank you very much, evolution. We have this hair trigger reaction about who is on my team and who isn't. And it gave us a survival advantage, back when we had to band together for protection. But right now, what we have is people who, we're seeing, good data, psychological data. Jonathan Haidt, a well-known psychologist, tells us, whether we are attracted to change or if we prefer continuity. Qualities that are individual to us that quite literally make us more likely to be a liberal or conservative. These aren't just opinions. We're talking about significantly inherited qualities that make up our identities, and we're physiologically wired to defend them. So if we're going to live in a world where we actually can take in new information, where we can sit in a room and hear people that we disagree with, we need to learn to frame conversations in ways that don't challenge our identities. Brain science tells us that we actually can use our full intellectual capacity better when we don't trigger that us and them and fight or flight response. And so if we can frame issues not as either or, but really generative, let's think of new ways, third ways, that helps us keep our minds open to new solutions. So it's way more important now than ever.
So how do you think we could best adapt our current system and adapt it for the 21st century to current current realities that we have. I mean, one thing that comes up frequently in conversations I have around the subject is the role of social media, for instance, which the perception seems to be it has a fairly, on balance, a somewhat corrosive effect. People, instead of talking to each other face to face, they'll shoot off a Facebook message or something like that, and they don't even know who they're talking to or whatever. And the effect is much harsher. So given the 21st century realities that the founding fathers in the 1780s had no clue about, how can we adapt our system and make it workable or better workable today?
Well, you had a wonderful interview, I think it was in March, with Amanda Ripley, who wrote High Conflict. So glad that you brought her to your viewers. And if folks haven't seen that, you should go back and watch that interview. She's a really brilliant journalist. And one of the things she said is that when we have high conflict, when we have polarized, either or, good, bad, good, evil framings, she said curiosity is the first casualty of high conflict. So many of today's hot topics, whether it's citing alternative energy or school consolidation, immigration, many of them are so complex that they are what analysts call wicked problems. So science can't give us a simple one right answer. Because there are, like I said, competing identities and underlying values. And so, and at the heart of these tough decisions, this is why social media, and answer your question, is so not helpful, because it lends itself to tweets and little tiny simplistic right or wrong, good and evil answers. And in fact, in these tough decisions, there are oftentimes two crucial interdependent variables that seem like opposites, but in fact, that have to coexist. It's the good guys versus the good guys. We know that, for example, in alternative energy sector. We all want to not have global warming. We want to have alternative energy, and we also value our ridge lines, or and want to save wildlife. So again, good guys versus good guys. The world is actually full of polarities, and you and I manage them every day. So two good things that seem like they are in conflict and in fact have to coexist. A parent, for example, parents have to be firm and they have to be flexible. They have to be both. And if you are a parent, you know that if you're only firm and never flexible, you're the worst parent in the world, unless you are a parent who's only flexible and never firm. Then you're also the worst parent in the world. You have to have both. And a good boss is both, grounded and visionary. Organizations have to embrace both continuity and change. I mean, here in Vermont, right, since 1788, we have somehow functioned under the paradoxical motto of freedom and unity. And if we were completely free, we could never be unified. And if we were totally unified, we would not be free. So how do we do it? The way that we manage polarities or wicked problems, which is when you have multiple polarities, right? So like a town planner has to consider, one group's interest in wildlife, another one's interest in economic vitality, another one in affordable housing, and then they make a decision that somehow balances those. No single solution is going to please everyone. The key with polarities is that they are never solved. They are managed. They are navigated. Most of our problem-solving models that we have in our world focus on two things. Either they focus on expertise, we'll bring in an expert, and that person will solve our problem, or on activism. We'll have a big fight, and one side will win and the other will lose, and that will solve the problem. And with polarities and wicked problems, they are inherently different. They do not respond to technical solutions. They do not respond to advocacy. What they do respond to is slow, trusting, face-to-face communication. And there's a wonderful professor in Colorado, Martin Carcassonne. He says that with wicked problems, the solutions begin when we recognize that it's the problem that's wicked and not the people. So the trick is that rather than thinking about solving a wicked problem, we need to think about managing them, naming the competing values, exploring the trade-offs together, and doing that hard work of finding the right balance in each case. And knowing that democracy is an organic process. It's not a machine. You don't just like fix it. It's an organic process, and we are going to have to come back again, just like we have to come back to your garden. It's not done. You're going to have to weed it. You're going to have to fertilize it. You're going to have to, some stuff is going to have to be replanted, and you'll have to start again next year. Those are all things that we need to think about when we are dealing with polarities and wicked problems.
So I've often thought that Vermont's traditional town meeting format is sort of the classic example of what you'd call slow democracy. Everyone comes into the school gym or wherever, and the moderator summons everyone to order, and line by line, the town budget is analyzed and dissected, and whatever other issues might be on the warning get discussed, and then people vote on it. But there's, as I'm sure you point out in the book with Frank Bryan that you co-authored, there's been a lot of issues around town meeting as to whether or not it really is a representative democracy experience when a fraction of the town's checklist shows up for the in-person meeting, and many more go vote by Australian ballot the next day, who may not have had the benefit of hearing the discussion about some of the articles on the warning or the town budget or whatever. What are your thoughts on where town meeting stands at this point? Are we at a place where, hey, it's working pretty well, just like it always has, and no need to tamper with it? Or are we at a point where it needs to be rethought a little bit as being the way local town democracy gets conducted?
It's such an important question, and it is a question that every town, I think, needs to deal with individually, kind of like the polarities navigation that I talked about. It's not going to be the same answer for every town. But oftentimes the way that this is framed is an either or. It's oftentimes framed as it's going to be town meeting or it's going to be Australian ballot. And we frame it oftentimes with incomplete information about whether people have access to it. We assume that if they don't come, it's because they can't, rather than that they're not interested. Or if they can cast a ballot, then we get town meeting against 100% ballot participation, which is also inaccurate. It varies from town to town, but on average town meeting ballot voting in 2019 was just under 20%, 7%, I think it was. And it went up during the pandemic. I think the highest average I saw was 28%. And obviously, if we get a lot of ballots, we get better participation. But I think the highest average I saw was 28%. So the idea that you're having say 5 or 10% of the people at a meeting versus 100% in a ballot is just wrong. So understanding the dynamics, understanding, for example, Frank Bryan's 30 years of research that asked whether there was any systemic bias in who attends town meeting, because there is in ballot box voting. We know in the United States that you are much more likely to vote if you are white, if you are, advanced education, socioeconomic data, all of those things indicate if you're likely to cast a ballot. Interestingly, they do not show up that way with town meeting participation in that 30-year study that Frank Bryan did. And in fact, there was no link between socioeconomic data and a town's likelihood to have participation at town meeting. So those are surprising data points, I think, in this question about town meeting that need to come up when we are looking at that question, looking at the health of town meeting efforts. One of the tools that I'm using, a polarity, it's wonky name, polarity navigation tool, that I'm using with towns to have this conversation is so exciting and so rich. I love having this conversation in this expanded way, rather than just either or should we have town meeting or should we have Australian ballot? Let's look at let's look at democratic quantity, the focus on quantity, the focus on getting lots of people involved, and democratic quality, the qualities that we want in a participatory democracy. And let's talk about the benefits of focusing on those two, and let's talk about what happens if we over-rely on those. So it's a sort of four quadrant discussion where we talk about the benefits of democratic quantity. More people will participate. There's no public speaking required. With a ballot. It's quick and easy and private. It reduces the risk of people feeling intimidated or excluded. I mean, these are really compelling arguments. And so what if we just, switched entirely to ballot? Well, then you get to the overuses because, we lose our ability to amend, compromise. Leaders can't hear the ideas that folks, again, a ballot is just a yes or no. You don't get new ideas. It sort of encourages that simplistic thinking, increases the likelihood of uninformed voting. We know this from data on initiative and referendum research. We know that there's a lot of uninformed voting if we don't have a deliberative process attached. And we lose that social capital, that connection where we hear and learn from others' lived experiences, and the leadership and citizenship that come from it. So it's like there's benefits, there's overuses. Likewise with the focusing on quality, we strengthen our democratic skills and our trust in the process. And we know that the more involved we are, the more we are likely to have faith in democracy. We all know that's a huge problem right now. People are losing faith in democracy. We can see our neighbors as whole people and not stereotypes. There's more power because we have the ability to amend, to deliberate. We get the stories from our neighbors who aren't necessarily, have the master's degree. These are folks who are telling lived experience. We get that from them. But when you come back to the question of ballot voting, so if we see town meeting as a legislature, which it is, it is it's not just a public hearing by any means. This is an empowered, deliberative process that does give people an embodied feeling of what democracy is. It's not just a feeling; they are the government when they are in the town meeting. That's huge impacts on how we perceive our democracy. And we also want to improve and recognize how important it is to have lots of people involved, and we want to have no barriers to participation. Then we can pull out from that either or and start talking about both. And what are some ways we can, if we're going to stick with town meeting, and if that town decides to stick with town meeting, how can we improve access, whether it's through better information, creating an operator's manual for the town, as several towns have done now, to make sure that everybody really understands how to participate, whether it's changing the timing of town meeting. Offering childcare is huge one. Do we need to start thinking about reimbursing people for their participation in our community affairs as needed, for travel, for childcare, for time? Those are, that's innovative stuff that's happening in many cities now. It's something we need to think about. Or likewise, if you are going to give up on your town meeting and move to Australian ballot, think hard about what are the ways that you are going to enrich the quality of participation, because that informational meeting, it's a public hearing. It's going to be very likely poorly attended, and it has no power. So what are some other ways that you're going to ramp up and there are some ways that towns are playing with now about maybe having a meeting in January, well before the warning is created. It's not allowed by statute right now, but we can think about the idea of having those meetings being empowered so that you could amend at that point. They do something like New Hampshire. Maybe really blowing up that meeting in a really big way, having a meal, having, kids come and present, having committees, have tables there. There are ways that a community could really supercharge the process if they are going to switch to a ballot. That might help. So thinking that way is, I think, the future in terms of keeping what's best about our current system and also growing it.
And I think we have time for just one final question. And I just wanted to try and ask you about some recent events that on the surface don't seem to have a connection between the two. But of course, the big story of the past week has been all the flooding that has taken place around the state, and certain towns being hit fairly hard, some of them here in our corner of the state in southwestern Vermont, and of course farther north as well. But I guess I just wondered, I was thinking about it as watching some of the news reports about it, that the recent flooding sort of seems to bring out a certain quality of, the neighbor helping neighbor mindset. Is that a form of slow democracy in a way? Or is there a connection there? Or am I just coming up with something that doesn't really exist?
No, you're not at all. There's a huge connection. Many studies have shown that when a community has high participation throughout the year, democratic engagement, volunteerism, rich social capital, they are much more resilient when disaster strikes. And if you think, the term social capital, and it's measured by trust, and it's measured by volunteerism and engagement. If a town is rich in social capital, think of it as capital. It's a bank that you can go to and draw on. And in these moments, when we have rich social capital, this is when we come together and say, okay, we're going to draw on all of the work that we did through our slow democracy processes that created those bonds that are so important to our resiliency now. So this is what allows people to trust each other, to loan each other tools, to pop in and help with mucking out your basement, not just sit there and wait for FEMA. That's the last thing that Vermonters do, is sit there and wait. We are the government. We know how to be each other's support system. And that's because of our rich slow democracy.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Much food for thought. Anyway, again, for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it yet, the book is Slow Democracy, written by Susan Clark and Moden Teachout. And Ms. Clark, thank you very much for making the time for our conversation today. I really appreciate it. And I hope all is well up there in Middlesex.
So happy to be here, and it's such a great topic. Lots more to explore, as always.
Absolutely, boy, and there's a lot going on. Anyway, thanks again, and thanks to all of you who have been with us today. Hope you found our program interesting, and we'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, take care.